Today we're going to talk about the wonderful holy sonnet by John Donne, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. John Donne and Shakespeare sort of overlap just a little bit. We often call Shakespeare an English Renaissance poet, and we call John Donne a metaphysical poet. John Donne is interesting because early in his life he wrote a lot of hot and heavy love poetry, very much about romantic love. Then he experienced a conversion, he became the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, and he started writing religious poetry. And some of the religious poetry he wrote in sonnet form. He sort of did a genius thing with it. The sonnet is associated with romantic love primarily in its origins, but John Donne just changed the direction of love from this to this, from this to this, from divine love, romantic love to divine love. And we're going to look at these very dense little poems that he wrote and take a look at all the different poetic devices he used to convey his tones and his themes to his audience, which was not a beloved woman, but instead God. Let's take a look at this very famous poem, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. When we're looking at a Shakespeare poem, we never have to ask, is this Petrarchan or Shakespearean? We know it is Shakespearean because Shakespeare wrote it, but we do have to ask anytime we look at any other sonnet. So when we look at this sonnet by John Donne, we have to say, my first question is always, is it Petrarchan or is it Shakespearean? And we look at the rhyme scheme. Let's just look at the ends of the words. You, mend, bend, new. Do, end, defend, untrue. I see an ABBA rhyme scheme, so I'm pretty sure right from the start that we are looking at a Petrarchan rhyme, Petrarchan sonnet. Now sometimes the ABBAs fall apart as we move down to the CDEs. We see feign, enemy, again, I. I know enemy and I don't seem like they rhyme, but that seems to be a CD rhyme scheme. And then Donne does something surprising. He has a rhyme couplet at the end. So he goes ABBA, CD, EE. So he kind of has a combination because the rhyme couplet is definitely a mark of Shakespeare. So we look at this, we say Petrarchan with some variations for the most part. That rhyming couplet is always a very strong way to end the poem. Now, the second thing we do after we look at the sort of rhyme scheme and determine if it's Petrarchan or Shakespearean, we just look at the structure of the poem. Now, you would need to read it on your own first, but since I've read it, I can sort of jump into the structure and sort of show you. The rhyme scheme kind of gives us nice quatrains. We have one idea. You can see that the beginning of the sentence is here, and it does not end until it gets down to that period. And he does the same thing here. We have another quatrain. And then we have our volta. We see that conjunction, but, no, so, something like that. Here it happens to be yet, and that is where the poem turns a little bit. And we can see that it's hard to sort of find the end of that there. This seems to be one sentence. So we sort of have two sentences and then sort of one big sentence. Now, what is this poem, right? One of the questions we ask about poetry. This poem is a prayer. And this poem is a plea. It sort of has an almost begging tone here, even though it opens with command. Now we know that sonnets are written in iambic pentameter, which they're written in the iamb meter, which begins with a soft stress and ends with a hard stress. But Donne does something interesting here. He begins with what we would call a trochaic word. He starts with a stress, because the first word he uses has some powerful connotations. It's a violent word. We might say that this poem is filled with a lot of violent diction, something we don't typically associate with prayers or with talking to God. Most of us would not talk to the divine with violence in our language, but John Donne does, because he has this sort of desperate, begging, pleading tone where he's asking God to possess him, right? So the first line is a command. Batter my heart. And that's sort of a war image as well, isn't it? Like a battering ram, which we've seen Shakespeare use in one of his poems. Break through into my heart to move from the literal meaning of this is to be violent to something. And the figurative meaning is that he feels like he's locked God out of his life, and so he's desperately asking God to do anything it takes to come through and to communicate and to establish communion with him. So he begins with a command or a plea. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. Now, this poem is just densely packed. It's almost Shakespearean in that. I'd point out to you that this is an enjambed line. We don't stop at the end of that line because there's no punctuation. And we immediately just kind of continue the line. For you, right now, you're not doing enough for me, is what Donne is saying. You are not battering my heart. You're doing what I would call gentle actions, right? We would look at the gentle verbs that are here. Right now, God is just knocking, breathing, shining, and seeking to mend. It does seem like, this poem is a Christian poem, so it's dealing with the Trinity. Jesus typically knocks, the Holy Spirit typically breathes, and maybe God the Father shines, and maybe this last one, seek to mend, is the Trinity in one. So we get 3 verbs plus 1, right? Knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. Now, I would point out to you that sonnets are very small, but they're doing a lot of work in a small amount of space. Notice that he heightens the rhetoric. A lot of times, sonnets increase in their drama as they go. Knock will turn into the violent word break. Breathe will turn into blow. Shine will turn into burn. These are all like taking the gentle verbs and making them in sort of more aggressive. And the seek to mend, which is to repair, becomes sort of toss me out and just make me new. We also notice one other poetic technique that Donne is using here, which is paradox. This is useful when we talk about romantic love and very useful when we talk about religion. Religion tends to be filled with a lot of paradoxes. A paradox, of course, is a seemingly contradictory statement that is nevertheless true. Here we see contradictions, right? Like that's what makes it paradoxical. Donne requests, so that I can rise and stand, he wants to move upwards, so that I can be who I need to be, so that I may rise and stand, or throw me and bend. We have these 2 words linked together, which are the opposite of rising and standing. He wants to be knocked down. Knock me down so that I can stand up, is basically what he's saying. So the poem opens with this tremendously dramatic request to God to possess him in some ways. Well, the possession image actually comes later in the poem, but he wants God to get through to him. He's got obstacles to his faith, and he feels helpless, and so he's kind of requesting God to break through and to get communication with him. The second stanza, and Donne was always known as the metaphysical poet, like I said, because he's tremendously intellectual. Sonnets are both intellectual and emotional at the same time, and they're often built on comparisons. Here we see a simile. And this simile is fairly extended. It kind of lasts for the whole second quatrain. I am like a usurped town. Now, usurped means taken over. An enemy has possessed me and now is in control of me. So he says, I am like a usurped town to another due. I belong to you, God, but I have been taken over, presumably by Satan. Let's read the quatrain. I, like a usurped town to another due, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but as captive proves weak or untrue. You can see that Donne takes this simile and he unpacks it quite a lot. He says that I am a town that belongs to God, but I have been possessed by Satan, and the doors are locked, and I am laboring to admit you. And we can see that the heightened emotion with that, what I call the inexpressive O, but it is the expressive O. It means I'm just making a sound because I'm so emotionally overwhelmed. But we see that he says that reason is my viceroy. Reason is my governor, in other words. It governs my town, or the mayor of my town. And reason tells me that I should defend my town. But reason is not helping me here. My reason is corrupted. It is captive by Satan. It proves weak or untrue. So even though I rationally know I should pursue you, God, I'm still not doing it because reason is corrupted and I don't want to. Something's wrong with me, therefore I need your help. We can sense the increasing desperation of Donne in the poem. And of course, this is 2 sort of what I would call downward motions of like, oh my goodness, I really need you. And I'm fighting you possessing me. But we have a turn here in some ways. I would say the poem doesn't turn very dramatically, but we see that he acknowledges that even though my reason is corrupted and I am not admitting you into the town of my heart, yet dearly I love you and would be loved fain, like I would prefer to be loved by you, but I am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. I had to read all 6 lines because they don't really break, right? He's sort of overwhelmed with his desire for God to possess him. So he loves God and wants to be loved by God. And we get a second comparison. Now the simile is turned into a metaphor. It's a metaphor of marriage. I am betrothed. I am married unto your enemy. I am married to Satan. So again, we sort of go back to the beginning of the poem where he's kind of requesting things. Using the imagery of marriage, he says, divorce me. Like, help me to be separated from Satan. Notice that the verbs move from line 2 to line 4 here, but he's moving quicker now. He says untie or break. He moves from untying, which is not quite as violent as breaking that marriage knot, because he's increasingly desperate for God to possess him. So we have an image of marriage, and then he says, take me to you, imprison me. I want to be your prisoner. And here we run into a second paradox. For except you enthrall me, I never shall be free. Now, in Old English, the word thrall actually meant slave. So when you are enthralled by somebody, you are enslaved to somebody. If you've ever had a crush on somebody and your entire outlook on your day depends on how they're treating you, if they treat you good, you're feeling good. They treat you bad, you're feeling bad. You are enthralled, my friend. And here, Donne wants to be enthralled by God because he says, in that religiously paradoxical way, until you enslave me, I can never be free. Slavery to God is freedom, seems to be what he's saying there. And he says he can never be chaste. Chaste is a fancy word that means pure. I can never be pure except you ravish me. And this is where Donne sort of makes us clutch the pearls, as I like to say. I'm like, oh my goodness, the language has gotten too violent for me here. Because ravish, we would probably translate that word as rape. So he actually uses a sexual image at the end of this poem to describe how he wants to relate to God. He says, I can never be pure unless you rape me, which is too much for me, for the most part. But I can see and appreciate how the language is getting increasingly desperate and powerful as it goes. So what is this poem? It's a desperate prayer for God to possess him. How does it begin? It begins with request. How does it end? It ends with assertion. He is still making a request. The poem doesn't really solve the problem where suddenly I am possessed by God, but he just acknowledges his situation, that I can't ever be free until you imprison me. I can't ever be pure until you ravish me. That's my situation in some ways. The most important word of the poem, it depends on which verb you like the best. I'm sort of into ravish because it's the most shocking word in the poem, but I also am very, very fond of enthrall because he wants to be enslaved to God. So a very dense little poem in just 14 lines, but we can sense the desperation and power of Donne's language.